President, Ambassador, friends, you are all very welcome this morning to this very special occasion launching the Flourishing Society. This book that we're launching this morning is an attempt to articulate a new vision for Irish society and to outline the key implications of such a vision. It has struck me that it's a venture, it's a new beginning in terms of our articulation of a civic republic, and T.S. Eliot said, any new venture, new beginning, is a raid on the inarticulate. Well, we hope that we have articulated clearly some of the challenges facing this country in thinking and bringing new thinking to our debates at a very timely time when we're contemplating constitutional reform, and the President has inaugurated a very seminal series of seminars. So it does help to become more articulate about our aspirations and our values. Of course, it's not an easy task to articulate and describe what might amount to a radical paradigm change for Irish society, moving from a dysfunctional neoliberal state and society, which we're currently experiencing, towards a more genuine civic republican society and state. So we do dare to imagine, as essayists and TASC in its guiding vision in the book, dares to imagine and describe an attractive alternative, setting out a framework for what the important political philosopher Michael Sandel has described as a new politics of the common good. Such a politics is urgent if the positive opportunities, as I say, that are going to be opened up by seminars and the constitutional reform that is in contemplation for Ireland now to review the 1937 Constitution. Simply my responsibilities this morning are to, as editor, is to express my deep thanks to those over the last couple of years who have been reflecting with us as essayists. I believe each one of them have made an original and important contribution to what will become, I believe, an essential national conversation, which must result in deep-seated change in our civic and political culture, and indeed in the political consciousness and behaviour of us all as Irish citizens. Philip Orr's essay brings to the fore the moral philosophy of Francis Hutchinson, the great Irish philosopher, and his understanding of the human person, and that understanding, of course, is the fundamental building block of our new vision. Robin Wilson's analysis of the Nordic model and what we may learn from it, I believe, will become essential reading for anybody interested in shaping a better future for Ireland. Sinead Pentony, in her essay, underlines the absolute necessity to remoralise the discipline of economics, better described, perhaps, as the new political economy, where Nobel laureates such as Amartya Sen and Joseph Stiglitz have been leading the way. And indeed, Slee Ella, my anonymous public servant friend, sets the reform agenda for the major institutional reforms now so urgent. So it has been a teamwork and a very satisfying experience working with such wonderful essayists. I would like finally to thank everybody in TASC, headed by the director, Dr. Nat O'Connor, and all the staff there. They're a wonderful team and a treasure in our intellectual infrastructure in the country. Above all, of course, I want to thank the President for doing us the great honour of coming and launching the Flourishing Society. He has inspired so much of our thinking in his long and distinguished career in public life, and indeed in his seminal addresses and publications. And I would now like to welcome the President of Ireland to address us today. So please join me in welcoming President Michael D. Higgins.
I want to give the title to what I have to say on the occasion of the launching of these essays as towards an emancipatory discourse. I borrowed the word emancipatory from my daughter Alice Mary Higgins quite a long time ago. So long ago I've almost forgotten, so I regularly use it now. But this is what the essays provoked in me, was a consideration of what might be, as it were, emancipatory scholarship. And so I welcome the publication of these essays from TASC under the title The Flourishing Society. And I also want to do something in words that perhaps the letter from Orison Uthro may have put in a rather flat way, is that when TASC wrote to me and told me these essays were afoot and that they were anxious to cooperate with my project of a presidency of ideas, I warmly welcome that. And I very particularly warmly welcome the offer of TASC to make their research and publications available to me on an ongoing basis and to be of assistance. This is work we must do together. The essays by Robin Wilson, Sinead Pentiney, Philip Orr, and the pseudonymous Schliele. We are now entitled to accuse everyone of being Schliele, which is probably the best way of doing it. And with their introduction by Fergus O'Farrell are a real contribution to the discourse we need and must not avoid at either Irish, European and at global level. In his introduction to these essays, Fergus, whom you've just heard, draws on the work of Hannah Arendt for inspiration and indeed for injunction too, as he writes, "As we learn from the work of Hannah Arendt, the political philosopher, whose seminal work reflects so profoundly on the human awfulness of the 20th century, there is a fundamental relation between thinking and right-doing, and in the reverse, between thoughtlessness and wrongdoing. The capacity to think is inherent in the human person, but must be developed. We need to develop opportunities for such fresh thinking by all citizens who wish to be free of received unexamined beliefs. In dark times, thinking brings much needed light and clarity. Thinking becomes crucial in freeing ourselves from the scripts and standards that we too often take for granted, or that may be regarded as immutable even when they bring crisis and disaster in their train. Thinking is vital not only in moments of crisis, but will remain essential in times to come when we have brighter possibilities before us. We are challenged at this historical juncture to think afresh in a very fundamental way and to think big for Ireland in these dark times. That is Fergus writing on page 7 of the book. Now, TASC's vision charts a route to social progress which offers another way, which recognises that it is neither possible nor desirable to replicate the consumption-led, debt-fueled economic growth of the late Celtic Tiger years. It paints a picture of a vibrant public realm with a focus on the collective consumption of social goods, such as education, transport, and healthcare. This is an area into which I cannot delve in depth, but must return at some stage as to whether the relative contribution of neo-Keynesians and institutionalists are relevant at that point. But when one reads the thought-provoking essays in this TASC publication, the enormity of the task ahead is clear. Irish society is being challenged to little less than to remould itself. Sinead Pentiney writes, "The economy needs to be re-embedded within society rather than being viewed as separate from the functioning of wider society. This re-embedding will require a number of key issues to be addressed." And as I read that, I thought of an essay nearly 20 years ago, widely distributed in the economic literature by Michael Volkerling, in which he spoke about, for example, culture and economics, and of economics being restored to a cultural debate and both being part of a general social debate. But over the last 20 years, there's been little serious economic scholarship, theoretical scholarship, on actually examining the price paid for this dislocation, as I will refer to it later, of economics from political economy to what Johan Galton has called capitalistics. I think that when Sinead writes that, she also draws our attention to some important other issues. And I'd like to add one of my own to it. She writes, "The International Labour Organization research also points out that insecurity is generated by patterns of economic globalization which produce endemic or structural insecurity in terms of employment, social welfare and income, due to countries racing to the bottom. It describes how footloose multinational capital and the demands of international economic competitiveness, by their very nature, undermine economic security, as companies can always move in search for higher profits and lower wages. And then she says, the second issue associated with embedding the economy back in the society requires us to reconceptualize the types of work required for human flourishing and a flourishing society. And of course, we were there before, many decades ago, the debate about the definition of work. To do this, she writes, we need to move beyond the division between paid and unpaid work, a division which assumes the former is more valuable than the latter by virtue of the fact that remuneration is attached. I think that it is very important that we, maybe if I pause and throw in one of my important footnote questions here. The ILO have recognised a particular problem, as Siobhan has Bentony has pointed out. And later in the essays as I go through them, and the reason I quote so much from them, because I want, this is the day of the essays, and it is they that must be given priority. And one of the reasons I went through them so thoroughly is that other questions were occurring to me. The ILO, that quotation is from the ILO, but why had the ILO such little capacity to change things? And later on I will come to, for example, my response to Amartya Sen, whose new introduction to the theory of moral sentiments is well written. But where is the change in Amartya Sen's assumptions from the previous model? What is his critique? And again, I will look, indeed, I think Fergus mentions the detail of the Stiglitz report, another Nobel economist, recognizing, for example, what was wrong. And then again it reminded me, did the World Bank not after all almost apologize for having neglected agriculture in Africa? But what changed with these admissions that come so late? And indeed I would urge the greatest of care, because I will come in a moment, to this notion anyway of the Nobel Prize in Economics, which is not really a Nobel Prize at all. It was funded by the Swedish Central Bank in 1969. And it was to be given at the same time as the other Nobel Prizes, so that people could kind of imagine that they were of the same level of intellectual caliber as Einstein and others. And it is of some interest, surely, when you realize of it, is that 70% of them in a 15-year period come from the University of Chicago. And 15 are nominated by a single person who is on the Nobel Committee. We'll come to that when I come to Professor Stein's point. But the Flourishing essays expressed hope. Their hope, their project, is to engage with others who have already made significant contributions to the debate about Ireland's future, and to encourage everyone in Ireland to participate in changing Ireland into a flourishing society. And I would point out, as I say these words this morning, a flourishing Ireland and a flourishing society, that all these arguments are relevant to the flourishing Europe, which is a Europe of citizens and a Europe of people, rather than where citizens and people in Europe are somehow or another to be regarded as the later consequences of an adjustment in fiscal advantage. This invitation to TASC issues is welcome. It includes all of us who believe in the transformative power of reflective scholarship. In my own inauguration speech, I said, we must work together to build a new citizenship for which we need a new discourse. We must seek to build together an active, inclusive citizenship based on participation, equality, respect for all, and the flowering of creativity in all its forms. TASC took up that challenge, such a challenge, some time ago, in seeking to develop a new discourse, and I praise them for it. And the Flourishing Society essays of this morning, I think that they represent TASC's latest contribution to the public debate on Ireland's future, as a democracy and as a republic. TASC's vision is of an Irish society with equality and social justice for all, based on a sustainable economy, accountable government, and strong public participatory engagement. This publication is timely, and we do indeed need to take stock and consider how we want to live, what is it we want for our society, and what we need to do to realise these goals. These Kantian questions to which I made reference at the beginning of my own presidency. And as we struggle in very difficult economic circumstances, it is even more important than ever that we're willing to envisage and debate a future for Ireland. So TASC's vision is of a flourishing society. What does that mean? It evokes the idea of human flourishing and of people developing their capabilities to live their lives to the full. The Flourishing Society essayists believe that we flourish best when we have autonomy and when we exercise this autonomy in positive relationships with others, when we have scope to use our creative potential, and when we can help meet each other's needs. Fergal O'Farrell puts it this way in the introduction: this more accurate and rounded concept of the human person contrasts sharply with the merely self-interested maximizer of commodities propounded in neoliberal ideology. It also generates a rich conceptualization of what society as a whole can achieve. I think what I think is very important is to realize and accept the principle of the social basis of creativity. There is always in the history, as we move into our discourse, two quite different traditions of human rights thinking, for example. Some based on the community and in the collective, others based on the individual. There's the difference between the United States origins of the human rights debate and the European one. These are important distinctions, and I'm very happy to be able to say that I think that this kind of work is very, very important. The question about capability has its tensions in relation to capabilities set in contexts and contingencies which involve the role of the state and the role of social group and, for example, the neglected issue of power. I think as well I'd like to place to brighten my own thoughts up to some extent alongside the TASC essays, another paper that I had the privilege of hearing in Trinity College. It was a paper delivered by Professor Howard Stein of the University of Michigan to the Trinity International Development Initiative on the 16th of April 2012. And it was a great pleasure to go in from Morris and Upthron to Trinity College and to be able to be among academics again. An even greater privilege to be in an institute where I had been scolding them about their holding on to the De Soto model in relation to land tenure, that they now had a real radical giving a paper, probably one of the best people doing a foremost critique of the Chicago School. And in his paper, The Neoliberal Policy Paradigm and the Great Recession, Professor Stein made a valuable critique of the circumstances which led to the adoption of a single hegemonic model of economics and public policy. A model that, as you heard in the introduction, has delivered such disastrous consequences in social and economic terms, but which has not yet been discarded either as a principle tool or as an introduction to economics at the level of the academy. I was fascinated as an academic who had taught in university for quite a long while to listen to the review of introductory economics texts and the easy distinction in the very first chapters between anything that was normative and anything that was allegedly empirical. Right across, in other words, therefore, and one thought again of the Veblenesque notion of the idea which was there in Milton Friedman's thinking of habits of thought and how important habits of thought are if you are to inculcate the new ideology. So in responding to the TASC essays and that of Professor Stein, I wish to initially express a concern, of course, at the limited space being made available in the media. It's a great disappointment, and even in the academy in places, for such a discussion as might lead to options for a better model of economic strategy, as would give us a connection that we might wish to offer to others with social policy, or indeed a flourishing society being critically debated or adopted. a former colleague and respected one, Professor Sheila Drudy, recently reading a seminal paper in Stockholm on education at a time of economic austerity, quoted, for example, I think the most distinguished, whether one sees or not a limitation in his view as being bounded by Europe, most distinguished scholar in the social sciences on the issue of Europe is perhaps Jürgen Habermas. And he writes in his recent work, Europe, the Faltering Project, "My hope is that the neoliberal agenda will no longer be accepted at face value, but will be open to challenge. The whole programme of subordinating the life world to the imperatives of the market must be subjected to scrutiny. The agenda which recklessly prioritises shareholders' interests and is indifferent to increasing social inequality, to the emergence of an underclass, to child poverty, of a low-wage sector, and so on, has been discredited. With its mania for privatisation, this agenda hollows out the core functions of the state. It sells the remnants of a deliberative public sphere to profit-maximising financial investors, and it subordinates culture and education to the interests and moods of sponsors who are dependent on market cycles." And that's Habermas speaking of Europe. And indeed in the essays themselves, as I went through them, and I found that the sections that are taken from the Stiglitz approach, the crisis has distracted the United States and much of the world from longer-run problems that will have to be addressed. The list is familiar: healthcare, energy and the environment, and especially climate change, education, the ageing population, the decline in manufacturing, a dysfunctional financial sector, global imbalances, the United States trade and debt deficits. And then Krugman, another commentator in more recent times, Paul Krugman, writes, "First, the crisis of the euro is killing the European dream. The shared currency, which was supposed to bind nations together, has instead created an atmosphere of bitter acrimony. Specifically, demands for ever harsher austerity, with no offsetting effort to foster growth, have done double damage. They have failed as economic policy, worsening unemployment without restoring confidence. A Europe-wide recession now looks likely, even if the immediate threat of financial crisis is contained." So let us think then, if so many conversions have taken place, if so many people have seen that the paradigm has failed, if an alternative paradigm is required, why have we not more discussion, one must ask, in a democracy on the paradigm? And what's happening in scholarship, and what's happening in the economy, what's happening at the general level in relation to all of this? It's rather like, as they say in the country song, they have not gone away. So have all the neoliberal theorists, remember, standing behind the policy positions, were schools, faculties, universities. And I think that if you're to understand that, therefore my slight quibbles with the essayists, and I assure you, I don't want for a second to take from their optimism, but I get a suggestion that it is almost as if we could recover a certain sense that might enable us to get to the new paradigm. But I have to suggest to you that you will search in vain for evidence of there being that different. Because what I believe myself is that it is all to be created in consciousness, quite new rather than recovered. And what I suggest about that is that the adoption of the critical mindset suggested in the TASC essays requires little less than the creation of a values discourse that would be emancipatory, rather than any recovery of any values previously accepted or made more general. We had these debates before about James Connolly and so forth, and whether an ancient Celtic society was egalitarian. And if we could only get sufficiently far into the past, we were not only occasionally kings, but we were equal as well. I am afraid when we actually submit the scholarship of this to some when we do the work, the challenge is indeed immense. So we're not in a period, either, this is therefore I think in relation to it, we're not in a period where the failures of the paradigm that has failed is in fact immense, has been sufficiently critiqued. I said in advance to Nash that I needed a bit more time. So therefore you must excuse me. I have cleared it in advance. I said I can't come along and launch these essays in 10 minutes because I have too much respect for them and for the issues that they raise. Sticking to my point, I think that what we need therefore is to create rather than to recover. And I think that we're not in that period. The paradigm that has been destructive needs analysis. And it has certainly not been abandoned, nor had the habits of mind inculcated in support of the paradigm been lost. The people who should advise us on this are students, and I'm hoping that this discourse goes out of here, goes through universities, going to schools and student unions, and involves all citizens. What is being taught is crucial as a creation of a habit of mind. There's no point in saying you have some kind of reluctance in yourself that your ethics is being suspended, but you have to teach this stuff because this is what everyone teaches. That's a challenge to us, and quite a moral challenge. We're not either, as I've said, therefore, discussing any fall from a previously inclusive republic that ever existed. We can point in our history, indeed, and find back through the 19th century to Hutchinson in the 18th century to, if we like, the utopian tradition. But we can point, I suppose, to that time when it got down on paper, such as in the democratic programme of the First Dáil. But the democratic programme of the First Dáil, the conservative forces there, quickly and clearly established that the interests of native capital and property would in fact defeat any aspirations towards the right of children or education or shelter. Reason too, the document was used as a tool for legitimation at local level. To suggest that there was a reforming socialist presence within the nationalist urge of the time that was greater than it actually was, when in fact it was very limited. It also was used abroad to secure legitimation for a state that had many populist elements. But it was deflected then in its aims, as I've said, all of those aspirations were defeated by the property ethos that had come to define post-famine economic adjustment in Ireland. I require another period for which I will be turning to that particular problem, but we cannot forget that the walls that went around the property after the great exodus of the famine are of immense significance and are not unrelated to the great silence which descends in relation to discussing how the Irish property class came into being and and the prices paid for it. So the essays representing as they do, they represent a critically engaged scholarship, clearly establishing that the issues that have to be resolved are beyond the frame of managerial thinking. I'll give you an example of that. It's sometimes suggested that the role of president, speaking in public, might be to make people feel good. I hope I do occasionally. But the fact also, I'm not there as a descriptive force. I could give this in response to these essays and simply say, yes, we have a real problem now. The numbers under 17 are increasing. The numbers between 19 and 24 are decreasing. And therefore the number who are aged are increasing, so the dependency sector is growing. This is a great challenge. But what would be the value of that? We need more than description. We need the courage of analysis and action and critical scholarship linked to action that will bring change. As I've said as well, the challenge is that of replacing a discourse, its delivery into the public debate at institutional level, where it is so desperately needed, and a demand for space for discussion in the media of public consciousness, that is, if we are to encounter the full power and promise of democratic inclusion. And therefore then to the three essays I say, they are in fact writing at a time that is just as important in terms of the crisis it's facing at the end of the 19th century, when the great documents of Durkheim, Marx and Weber and others came onto being. Society was in conditions of change. And I think, therefore, because I do have coming over time, I think if the devolved policies of post-independence contradicted the language we used in the case for freedom, the ideas of a utopian kind were made available again and again. What is extraordinary is the indomitable manner in which people's decent instincts are always there. It's very, very interesting to see some of the photographs I look at as I was speaking in Piedmont Hospital the other day of Lady Aberdeen stirring a pot of soup for the children and the families of the lockout in 1913, and so on. So therefore that raises a question that all the essays have in common, that it isn't in fact actually a case of defining the class, the militant struggle within it, and the appropriate action as that which will constitute the force of change, but the power of strong ethical impulses as well. I have to say, for no other reason I would like to come, is to thank Philip Orr for a most beautiful essay on the neglected Francis Hutchinson that brings us back to a time in moral philosophy in the 18th century of ethics, political economy, and moral philosophy combined. They were not only not divided from each other, but they drew on each other for sources of the good person, the good life, and the good society. And I'm back to Kant again. Philip Orr wrote in his beautiful essay, "One obvious consequence of belief in a web of instinctive human benevolence is support for a politics that acknowledges such benign proclivities that puts them to good use. Thus for Hutchinson, a wise politician, perceiving that each individual is part of a great whole or system, would devise constant opportunities for the individual to concern himself with the public good. Because humans have a nature that is designed for the good of others, a healthy society would be one where the capacity for public love, dedicated to the public good, is allowed free rein with general benefit." In a time, Philip Orr writes, when Irish people have been forced to look back with shame and horror at the harm done to so many children ever since the establishment of the modern Irish state, within soulless education and social care environments, in a range of brutal corrective establishments, and under the abusive tutelage of some members of religious orders, and who are entirely unfitted for the task, it is refreshing and challenging to encounter Hutchinson's advocacy of the innate worth and dignity of the child, and to consider whether the writings of the 18th century moralist of Drumcondra Lane should have been on the curriculum of all Irish teacher training colleges and Christian seminaries, rather than languishing on a shelf in Ireland's philosophy departments as irrelevant dust-covered texts. And as I'm speaking here, just a few days ago, Richard Carney in Australia was giving a lecture on why politics needs philosophy. And you really read the power of that kind of writing. And you see the other way, which is in fact the philosopher that entered the politics that stands at the back of, say, the Chicago School, is quite close to that of Mandeville, which suggested that we are inherently evil and limited. I think even then in Adam Smith's later work, it is fascinating, which would be abused, as I've said, by the school. But I think that even if Adam Smith's later work would be the material for a great and successful distortion, Philip Orr reminds us that in the theory of moral sentiments, which you will know appears 8 years before The Wealth of Nations, and is that powerful reminder that those who provided the seminal ideas in political economy when it was a real subject and a craft preceded their work of a technical kind with moral reflection, as is the case in the relationship between the theory of moral sentiments which precedes the Wealth of Nations. And Philip Orr writes, however selfish man may be supposed, there are some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortunes of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. The human desire to offer, receive, and witness benevolence. And that is something that brings it beyond the social sciences analysis of the gift relationship or that discussion on reciprocity. It is as even if one is not involved in the exchange that one witnesses, the act of benevolence itself has a wonderful effect on those who are in the society. So therefore I have my difficulty now as I come to the end that I had with Amartya Sen's most recent position. is reflected too in these essays is in relation to how the capability approach is to be located, how it can flow into new and mostly badly required policy discourse. And I have a feeling that the difficulty I have is that when I look at the new introduction to the theory of moral sentiments which Amartya Sen has written, I don't see a sufficient departure or a sufficient critique of the model that has been built on a distortion of the wealth of nations. It is as if, having forgotten about, if you like, ethics, politics, morality, political philosophy, you can almost suddenly remember it again, as if one had just left it aside, and so forth. The critique that is required of that from which we need a departure requires more from Amartya Sen, and it requires more from Joseph Stiglitz, and it requires more from those who, in fact, to some extent, now have a position in which they're willing to recognize the ashes of what has burdened around them. I think that it is in many cases as well, in relation to this, and as I finish, it is why I added in the recent paper of Professor Howard Stein. Howard Stein refers to those who still defend the Chicago School's position as ideological warriors. This is his description for them in his paper delivered in Trinity. But you must remember, how did it come to be? There is no accidental, mistaken accretion in thought in relation to the neoliberal paradigm that has delivered the disaster we have, and that still threatens. Because if one is in doubt about whether or not it still threatens, one of the more horrifying details that came out of the paper was in relation to the massive expanse in speculation in relation to food commodities. I looked at Stein's other work and the kind of thing that comes out of it about instability. Just to give you an example. The number of commodity futures and options contracts increased dramatically and reached 70 million contracts by 2010, up roughly 10 million from 10 million contracts in 2003. By 2008, the value of outstanding derivative contracts in commodities hit nearly $14 trillion, compared to around $1 trillion in 2003. Commodity markets are being driven not by fundamentals of producers and end users, by other factors. Among other things, commodities are seen as a good hedge when the value of the dollar falls, which lowers the value of global commodities in non-dollar terms. And it goes on then. So in the midst of a food crisis in the world, we have speculation at the heart of it. So the suggestion that somehow or another some kind of the aficionados or the policy implementers of this particular paradigm have gone away. They most certainly have not. To be. The interesting side of it is, which I'm very pleased to, and I hope people will become more familiar on, is how it all came to be, this particular paradigm that has brought such results. It flows from Friedrich von Hayek's Road to Serfdom in 1944. But you know, one of the things that is interesting about the struggle that book had to be published, it was later serialized in an abbreviated form in the Reader's Digest, where it immediately attracted over 8 million readers, and 1 million reprints were rushed out from the Reader's Digest itself. It was consciously, quite consciously, delivered into the world with a particular purpose. I think as well that it is very important to realise, as I've mentioned earlier, as to how it all came to be. In the book having been published, then I think there was the funding by the Institute, the Mont Pelerin Society, which had been founded by von Hayek, and this in the 1946 funded a lecture tour of the United States. And then after that, the pressure came on to write an American version of The Road to Serfdom. And this would come in time, in 1960, from Milton Friedman. And then he would again write in 1980. I will have time in another place to give the full details of all of this, which I find very, very interesting, because I think that one of the most interesting ones as well is the manner in which the nominations take place. A single individual nominates Asa Lindbeck between 1969 and 2011, has nominated 15 quotation marks Nobel Prizes in economics. And I think, therefore, one must realise, as well as the academy changed in the United States, neoliberals were chosen, retiring institutionalists, post-Keynesians, Marxists and neo-Marxists were not only acquiring tenure, they were having goodbyes said to them. I finish by saying, therefore, this. Beyond all of what I have said in the importance of this essay, there is such a need to take the discourse and bring it into the most public space, but also to encourage people as well to actually singularly look at all of the assumptions, that we do so for humanity in general. What is the point of we saying we have, in fact, actually, we are now in a particular position ourselves, and we have to get out of these difficulties? These difficulties affect us all. I think that in relation to what I have just been saying, as we launch the Flourishing Society discourse, I have to remind myself again, just think about how words are important, how concepts come and go. Some of the youngest of you will remember, for example, a previous discourse within the European Union that balanced competitiveness with cohesion. Now take all your new electronic instruments and type in the word cohesion and see where it fits in any of the statements from the recent summitry. Where is the word cohesion? It has been systematically discarded. It doesn't occur anymore in major statements. And then again, I remain optimistic for the European Union of peace that was the legacy of war to which many of us committed ourselves. The European Union that might lead the decades following the Rio summit 20 years ago, that might give a lead in ecological responsibility and sustainable development. The European Union that would be, in a globally interdependent world, would take a lead in establishing rights, including labour rights. That has been given little room in discourse. And that's the discussion we want to put in place in the immiseration of the statements coming from those who have a temporary trade advantage within the European Union. I believe that the neglect of that discourse has placed the prospect of the European Union, of the peoples, of citizens, of ideals, of liberating scholarship at risk. And I believe that that is the price we are being asked to pay by the strongest in defence of their national trade advantage. The future of Europe, making an appropriate, sustainable contribution to human welfare and an ethical, if globalised economic future, needs to be reasserted in a time when the bleak prospect of a rescue to failed models as a mechanism to secure an advantage that has been achieved in contradiction to the principles of cohesion, no longer itself as a concept, at the centre of European Union discourse. All of that threatens our future. I finish by saying this was a characteristic feature of the post-1980 period, Sinead Pintoney tells us, dominated by neoliberalism, the Washington consensus, by the idea that the market knows best, and it was not appropriate for states to interfere in the efficient functioning of the markets. State intervention, far from being inherently inefficient, turned out to be essential to prevent total system-wide collapse. As a society, we cannot return to having blind faith in markets to deliver a future of endless, rapid and consumption growth. Of course I agree. And she goes on, therefore the role of the state must also be transformed if it is going to facilitate the shift towards a different type of economy. The experience of the Nordic countries gives us ample evidence of how strong social democracies can create the conditions for regulated social market economies, economies that afford their citizens a high quality of life and places equality at the core of public policy making. And you will see too in these essays the Nordic experience of fitting the NGO sector into a social policy framework and not just a narrower and lesser voluntarist model. Mar focal creac agus biansar of Lartlef, agus begahasaref will make cheer concrete. Surely too, legitimacy is enhanced by seeing economic policy as instrumental towards a flourishing society, rather than as a determining force of unaccountable and rarely transparent speculative forces, such as the ones I mentioned that are there living on parasitically on the back of food shortages in our world. These essays and the ongoing work of TASC are a valuable contribution to the restoration of trust, such a trust as we would use to bond the aspirations of citizens, the state and the world of work. So I think, therefore, I welcome Amartya Sen's reinstating of an Aristotelian view of freedom, such as would enable a human flourishing, and I hope he comes in time to fully critique the legacy of the Chicago School. I think as well that all of this discourse with which we're now invited is enormously valuable. It has been a great privilege to have been sent the essays, to have been allowed an opportunity to reflect on them. And above all, I want to thank you for the invitation to come here and offer a response. Thank you very much.
I'm very grateful that President Michael D. Higgins could be here today to speak to us. And I'd like to formally thank him for taking the time to craft a very memorable and inspiring speech today. And I think the President's focus on discourse was very apt. The importance of ideas, the importance of inculcating thinking about our world and how we can change it. And I know in the President's current seminar focused on being young in Ireland, the importance of then bringing ideas to young people, but also hearing young people's ideas about what they want their country to be like and their world to be like. And of course, how can we get more people thinking about values and talking about the most important issues facing Ireland? It's a tricky question, but one for which psychologists working on self-determination theory have provided some answers. And what's exciting about this psychological evidence is that it contradicts the spin doctors who think that people need to be manipulated as part of electoral politics. On the contrary, the psychological findings suggest that although everyone can be motivated by external concerns, like money and reputation, they are even more motivated by internal values, such as feeling in control of their own lives and feeling a common bond with others. In other words, values like liberty and solidarity. And the psychological evidence about intrinsic values chimes with the optimism of Francis Hutchinson about human nature, and it suggests that there is fertile ground for talking about civic republicanism, equality, and how to make Ireland a flourishing society. So on that note, it just remains for me to say a few more words of thanks. I'm very grateful to Fergus O'Farrell, who took a lead role as editor in working with the authors to bring the essays to today's launch. I'm likewise very grateful to my colleague, Sinead Pentney, who was central in TASC to making this project happen, as well as making an important contribution as one of the authors. My thanks also to John Fanning, who wrote the preface and came up with the title Flourishing Society. Unfortunately, John is unavoidably unable to be with us here today, but he's a very keen supporter of this project, I know. I'm very grateful to the other authors, Philip Orr, Sliella and Robin Wilson, each of whom has made a very valuable contribution. Thanks also to the Ireland Institute, who cooperated with us on an earlier phase of this project. And my thanks to everyone in TASC, especially Alex Clem and Sylvia Byrne, not least for organising today's launch and getting the essays physically here today. And thanks to everyone else who's involved in today. And thank you all for being here. And at this point, I'm delighted that the President is able to attend our reception. And I invite you all to join us for a cup of tea or coffee in the front rooms. And there's piles of the essays inside. I hope you'll all take away a copy. But before we go, I'd like to say thanks again for your inspiring words, President of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins.